everybody. Welcome to another webinar Wednesday. I'm super excited to have here somebody who's going to dig right into something really important in terms of product-led growth. We're going to be talking about product sales alignment as well as PQL, really like how to reduce that friction between product and sales team. We have Momo Ong. He is the co-founder of HeadsUp. Momo, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for the introduction, Ramli, and for the context.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I'm going to pass it off to you. And then if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, and then we can I can just ask it to Momo right away or near the end as well.
Yeah, and we have a pretty small group today. So maybe if y'all want, we can go around introducing each ourselves. Maybe that could make for a more intimate discussion. What do y'all think? Or I'm also happy to speak the whole time. Yeah. All right. I guess. All right. Okay. How about this? If I'll pause at different points, and if we want to talk about stuff and ask questions, feel free to interject. We don't have to wait till the end of the conversation. Cool.
All right. Yeah, I can just interject with the questions as well then. Okay.
Perfect. So, yep, my name is Momo, and I'm the co-founder of HeadsUp. So, HeadsUp at a high level, we're in the business of helping go-to-market teams, and initially specifically sellers, better understand what are the opportunities to engage in product-led growth companies. And once they understand that, helping them engage. So our product is divided into two core buckets. The first bucket is what we call define, right? So there we're all about surfacing product qualified leads. And the second bucket is engage, which is, okay, so given these leads are surfaced, how do you engage them? But this webinar is not about HeadsUp. This webinar is not about our product. It's about a higher level point, which arises in product qualified product-led growth companies, and also more generally in a lot of B2B companies. And that's the one of product sales alignment. And what we've realized as we built HeadsUp and as we've double-clicked into how to use the PQL, we realized that the PQL ultimately can become an interface, a source of alignment for both product and sales. And so through this webinar, we'll double-click into that, and I hope to convince you that the PQL is a good mechanism to align the product and sales teams. Yep. So without further ado, let's dive into the problem. So the problem here is that in most B2B companies, especially in product-led growth companies, there's tension between the product and the sales teams. So as a seller, you oftentimes feel that if only the features that your prospects want are shipped, right, you'd be able to better sell and better hit your quotas. There's always this misalignment. And the way it's currently solved is that sales and product teams oftentimes have weekly or bi-weekly syncs where sales team comes up with their requests, and product team takes that into account and then comes back with their prioritized list of what they want to build for this quarter, right? Their roadmap. And sometimes the requests are granted, sometimes the requests are not necessarily aligned with the broader product strategy. And so a lot of times people are frustrated, right? Sellers are frustrated because they might be a certain vertical, right? A seller might have a territory focused on a specific vertical, and none of the features that are highly requested by that vertical is prioritized. We see that a lot, and that's a big source of frustration and big source of tension between sellers and product managers. Any questions there before I move on? Cool. So the tension is also goes the other way, right? Oftentimes, I was a product manager at Fiscal Note, a B2B vertical SaaS company based out of DC, and I was always thinking, this feature that I shipped, or this new product that I shipped, did PMM do a good job to land it in market? Does the seller deeply understand the feature and the specific use cases and the workflows? Are they positioning the product correctly in conversations? Are they doing discovery well? And are they selling correctly, right? And oftentimes when, for example, there's not much usage or there's a revenue miss, as a PM, I can't help but wonder, is it really my fault? Is it my fault, or is it the seller's fault, right? So there's definitely that sort of tension. And if you look at both the seller's issue and like if you look at it from both the seller's perspective and also from the product manager's perspective, you'll see this problem is one of attribution. It's really hard to attribute impact or revenue to either the sales or the product team, right? When revenue outcomes are not hit, oftentimes there's a massive blame game where sales says, wait a second, if only these features were shipped on time, then we would have been able to close this amount of revenue, right? These are the prospects that are waiting on these features. And conversely, product would often say, wait a second, these features that are shipped, I feel that they're under monetized. Sales could do a much better job closing deals. So how do we solve this attribution problem, right? Actually, before I go on, there's a very interesting parallel here. This is not the first time this dynamic has surfaced. There's a similar dynamic between marketing and sales, right? Marketers often complain that the leads that they're generated are high quality and that sales aren't doing a good job closing these leads, right? That the MQL to SQL conversion is okay, but the SQLs are simply not getting closed, the sales qualified leads. But there's also the flip side, where sales says, wait a second, these MQLs, they're not interesting and they're not intentional, right? And so that's a well-known problem, of course, for folks that are on the go-to-market side. And for account-based marketing, there are actually tools out there like the 6th Sense, the Engagio, the Demand Bases of the world that have made progress on this problem. And the way they've made progress on this problem is by creating a shared marketing sales revenue goal, right? And by ultimately being able to assign a dollar, being able to qualify the lead that marketing generated to a certain dollar amount. So there's like an expected dollar per lead. And if, for example, sales closes that, then there's good attribution either way. Yeah. So this problem has been somewhat solved, or there's been good progress towards that on the marketing sales interface, specifically for named accounts, right? For account-based marketing. But what about if, for example, you're a product-led growth company and the vast majority of your users are not enterprise accounts, right? They're mid-market or SMB accounts. How do we resolve this tension between, in this case, product and sales? So this is going to be the talk, the majority of the talk. Yeah, so in this webinar, what we'll basically do is we'll walk through how by aligning on the concept of a PQL, a product qualified lead, sales and product can reduce tensions between each other and work in lockstep towards revenue outcomes. So that's it for the problem definition. I'll take a pause here. Does anyone want to discuss things, ask questions? Do you all have any anecdotes? Have you seen this in market?
I've definitely seen it. Yeah, like working in a B2B company as marketing as well. I saw that tension that you were talking about with product and sales.
So yeah, the product. So I think the marketing and sales one is very well known. The product and sales one, it's semi-resolved, right? People have weekly meetings, but I don't think it's been resolved in a more rigorous manner yet. Yeah. So first of all,
I would agree with that, Momo. I think it hasn't been resolved. Partly it's organizational as well, and who owns the revenue. But I think you're right, because what you're going to get into is how do you create an environment in which you could organizationally make this work by having the right information, right?
Yes, exactly. And on that organizational point, we're seeing more and more companies have revenue roll up to a single individual. So as opposed to marketing rolling up to the CEO, kind of customer success, sales rolling up to the CEO, those individuals roll up to like a CRO who's single-handedly responsible for revenue. And we're actually seeing that earlier and earlier in the company's life cycle. Oftentimes that would not be the case until pre-IPO, right? You'd have some sort of president individual or CRO individual. But these days we're seeing head of revenue at the Series A stage. And that could be a testament to the fact that these functions are more and more blurred, and they need to work more and more in lockstep with each other, as opposed to against each other, and hence requirement for the unity at the org chart level. Yeah.
Momo, I have a quick question related to that point. Does this mean that when they're hiring for sales and marketing roles, you now want someone who can kind of think on both sides of the aisle, or is it just about aligning incentives and kind of, you know, having them in the same room with the same conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. This discussion is going to be more about aligning incentives, but the skill set of a seller in a product-led growth company is definitely relatively different than a skill set of a seller in, okay, well, first of all, there are enterprise sellers, mid-market sellers, and SMB sellers in both PLG and non-PLG companies. And I would say the enterprise sellers in both are similar, right? They still need to engage accounts, they need to work the accounts, and they need to establish relationships with the appropriate decision makers and stakeholders within an organization. But I would say a product-led growth company has the added need to the individual needs to deeply understand product usage and data. So they generally need to be more data driven, right? They need to be able to understand product analytics, be able to make sense of that, and leverage that in conversations with the stakeholders. So what would, like, for example, if you're a seller in, not a head of sales, but like an account executive in a product-led growth company, say Notion, for example, and you're selling to like a JP Morgan, right? You would want visibility into how individuals within JP Morgan, different teams, are already using Notion from bottoms up, right? I mean, JP Morgan is not necessarily a good example because software usage is likely constrained in FinServ, but basically you want to be armed with that information and have that information be context to make your argument when you make the enterprise top-down sale. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah. So any other questions? Cool. All right. So let's go ahead, and the next part of this webinar is about what is the PQL, right? Like let's define what a product qualified lead is. So I think this is an interesting visualization that conceptualizes a PQL. So you can think of the product as this big C. There are a lot of users in the product, right? And accounts. And the question is, which of those accounts does it make sense to engage? And the product qualified lead, or the criteria of a product qualified lead, is the logic that we use to determine which accounts at that point in time it's worth engaging for the seller, right? And so you could think of the criteria as a net, and obviously the leads are the fish in this example. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting way to think about the product, right? Like oftentimes as a product manager myself, I don't necessarily think about the product as a means for nurturing leads for salespeople to close, right? I think about activation, I think about onboarding, I think about feature usage, but I don't necessarily think about generating leads. That's not really my goal, and I've never really done that either at FiscalNote. I definitely did not do that at FiscalNote. We were not a product-led growth company, nor at Facebook, really. Yeah. So it's like a pretty new concept, right? So that's the mental model. The product is a source of leads. The product, a PQL, are leads that are worth engaging at that specific point in time. Now, a product qualified lead is somewhat similar to an MQL, but it's also different. Like there are not that many MQLs, right? There's oftentimes leads are either marketing qualified or not. But for PQLs, there are many types of PQLs because there's many selling motions from the product, right? What does that mean? There could be free users that can be converted to paid. There could be paid users looking to be converted to enterprise. If there are multiple products, a PQL could designate a cross-sell motion, right? Opportunity for a cross-sell motion. And finally, there's also opportunity for conversion from from monthly billing to annual billing, right? That's considered an upsell as well, because the discount rate of of capital is obviously very high in businesses. So there are many types of PQLs. Oh, I saw Dev and Engheng. So Dev and Engheng are both my team members at HeadsUp. Thanks so much for joining and supporting me. Yeah, cool. So yeah, there are different types of PQLs, different types of fish that you can essentially catch using like a PQL criteria. Any questions on like how to think about the product, what a product qualified lead is, and a product qualified lead criteria before I move on? Okay, so now that we have level set on that definition, let's understand what sales does with PQLs, right? So I think this is pretty straightforward. It's similar to what, oh yeah, these are some examples of a PQL. So in Slack, an example of a PQL is 2,000 messages sent within a period of 2 weeks. That's highly causal towards a monetization outcome. Another question you all might have is how does a PQL relate to activation, right? So in product and in growth, there's this notion of activation, right? Has the user derived sufficient value from the product so that they will come back consistently to use the product at its natural frequency? That's the definition of activation. How does a PQL relate to activation? In my perspective, the PQL is even more intentional. It's deeper in the user funnel, in the user lifecycle than activation, because you can use the product consistently at its natural frequency and not be willing to upsell into it, into a upgrade into another tier. You could use a free account forever. Like I have a personal Notion and I use that forever, right? Like I'm never going to convert to paid. So I've activated on Notion, but I'm not a product qualified lead. So you can think of PQL or this concept of readiness to buy as one step more intentional than activation. Yeah, and so these are some definitions of a product qualified lead. We can go into, if y'all are interested in how these are generated, we have a whole article about that. And it's like another talk, right? Oh, at a high level though, there's 3 main components that go into a product qualified lead. The first is the notion, well, the most important thing is the notion of value. So is the lead deriving sufficient product value, sufficient value from the product? That's the most important criteria of the product, of the PQL. But also important are fit. So does it have a firmographic match? And this is similar to what you would see at an MQL, right? And also intent, right? Was there a hand raised? Did they sign up for a webinar? This is also similar to what marketing looks for as well. But the thing that's new and that results in much more intentionality and higher conversions is this value piece. Are people consistently coming back to the product and deriving value at the level such that it warrants an upgrade? That's how I would think about the value definition. Cool. So we talked about what a PQL is. We've talked about what the components of a PQL are, and even gave some examples. Let's now talk about what sales does with product qualified leads. So pretty straightforward. This is the sales process, right? Sales gets product qualified leads. They decide which ones make sense to become a sales qualified lead. The AE qualifies that and begins working through the sales process. What's worth noting though is that because of consistent product usage and intentionality, PQLs generally convert 3 to 10 times higher than MQLs and are often the higher converting SQLs generated. We also see that the sales process is shorter. And finally, what's interesting is similar to in named account marketing, like in ABM, we can also attribute a dollar value to a product qualified lead, right? That makes sense because we generally know how many PQLs come into the sales pipe, right? And we know how many of those deals end up getting closed at the end of the quarter. So we can do a division. We can say dollars closed $1 divided by number of PQLs, and that gives us an average dollar for PQL. This is a very important concept because this is how sales and marketing this is the beginning of how sales and marketing will be aligned. Sorry, not sales and marketing, sales and product will be aligned.
This is just a question
So,
from Janet, Momo.
yes.
She asked, how do you define high value versus continued usage? The example of continued use of a free version.
So that's a good point. So number one, like the obvious things are, for example, a product has a paywall, right? Or like a feature is paywall because, or it's gated because it's only accessible to a higher tier. If the user keeps accessing that paywall, or different users within an account keep accessing that paywall, that's indicative of a signal that the account probably should be upgraded. Oftentimes, our account tiers are also segregated by a number of users, right? If user growth is of this account is increasing at a velocity such that it'll reach the free or current tier limit, that's also indicative of value that denotes a potential for upsell. And lastly, folks run a lot of data science on this, and there's generally a good way to identify correlations and causations, some of which might be explainable and some of which might not. So for example, if you have a product with, say, 30 different SKUs, right? Say ServiceNow with much more than 30, right? Like 50 different SKUs. There's ways to run data science to figure out, okay, if you buy SKU X, Y, and Z, then you have propensity to also buy SKU W. Yeah. So I think those are the three main ways to identify and tease out value. From a first principles perspective, the general way to do it is to look at what the tiers, look at what are the properties and usage properties that the tiers are delineated by, and identify usage that exceeds the cutoff of certain tiers, or will exceed the cutoff of certain tiers.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions?
Momo, maybe just to build on that last one from Janet. So is it typically taking a retrospective view to determine what those cutoffs might be? Meaning you look at your highest tier and you look back and see what characteristics they kind of share amongst that. Is that one way of doing it, or is that not?
Yeah, that's another. No, that's absolutely another way as well. We call it, or I think OpenView has called it, patient zero analysis. So for your most successful enterprise accounts or high paying accounts, look at the moment when they first joined, say a year ago, 18 months ago, and see what that behavior looks like, and generate lookalike accounts that mimic that behavior today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
But the strength of that also varies from product to product. So the strength of that signal also varies from product to product as well. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Generally, that's a much more effective method if there are a lot of users. So like if you have like tens of millions of users, then that sort of statistical method works much better. Yeah. So like, for example, in our product at HeadsUp, right, one of the ways we're working with customers to tease out these signals is we ask them, what are your best accounts? Like, please tell us your best accounts, and please tell us your worst accounts. And what we do is we run analytics to determine what are features that are strongly exhibited by your best accounts, and also correspondingly weakly exhibited by your worst accounts, right? And we see whether those are causal. So we see whether there are features that have that characteristic, and we suggest those into criteria. That's what we're building out in our product right now. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Cool. Anything else? All right, let's go on. We talked about what sales does with a PQL. Yeah, the TLDR here is it goes through the sales funnel, but it's a much more intentional sale and much more short sale oftentimes. And just to hit that point home, the reason it's a shorter sale is because the account is already using the product and deriving value from it, right? So they understand the product, they understand the value. And a lot of times there's high intentionality to buy. There's oftentimes a hand raise, for example. They've reached out on chat, or they've consistently sought for help, right? That makes the sales process much shorter. Cool. So product, what does product do with the product qualified lead? And this is interesting. And I think this is what's, in my opinion, less talked about and a little bit non-obvious. So as a PM, you can goal on activation, right? A growth PM would have a metric like increase the drop off or decrease the funnel drop off from onboarding to activation by X%. That's a very reasonable growth PM goal. But we believe that going forth, the product qualified lead will be like an even more intentional and bottom of the funnel goal for the product manager, right? We're able to define PQLs using criteria, like a metric, for example, right? And so we have this operational metric now that PMs can goal against. And so our hypothesis, and we think this really makes sense, is we'll see product teams in the future sign up for example, conversion to PQL goals, right? Like as opposed to increase the rate of conversion from onboarding to activation by 5%, PMs will increasingly say, I want to increase the rate of conversion from onboarding to PQL by 5%, because that's much more closer to revenue and much more tied to revenue. And when product signs up for a goal like this, something magical happens, right? Suddenly, there's a very clear revenue association with what they're doing. Because remember, we were able to calculate how much on average a PQL generates, right? We can calculate the dollar per PQL. So if product increases the number of PQLs generated this quarter, then you can simply multiply that number by the dollar per PQL to get the dollar impact of the product of a PM, right? And so then we can start doing interesting things like if the product team wants to figure out whether feature A or feature B makes sense, they can do an experiment where they essentially measure the impact of this feature on, for example, PQL conversion rate. And there can be a dollar value associated with each feature, right? So that's like a framework that we're hopeful that folks will start to employ. That isn't really employed these days by product and growth teams yet. The other reason we're hopeful is that when I was at Facebook, right? Facebook has a very clear CLTV, customer lifetime value number for every user, right? And it makes certain decisions, like for example, how to rank that individual's newsfeed, the amount of ad load to show for that user, based on their customer lifetime value. In a similar way, and the customer lifetime value is very clearly tied to revenue, right? In a similar way, I think B2B product managers will become much more rigorous and much more closely tied to revenue with this framework over time. So I'll pause here. Any questions about this concept? Because I think this is a pretty interesting concept. Yeah. Cool. Let me go forth then. So one way to here's one expression of a revenue equation, right? So Janet, did you have a question?
Yeah, I kind of did. It's a little bit off the specific topic, but it's sort of how do you get to that point, right? So if you're going to use product usage for to generate a PQL, and I mean, I think it's a great concept and could really move business forward. But I'm just curious, how do you actually get to the point where you've got enough people using it so that you've got data that is valuable? Because at some point you're putting something out there, probably a free version of something. You still got to find a market. I mean, you have a hypothesis about what that market is, but you've got to reach enough people, and some of it can go viral. But I mean, you still have to start somewhere. So I'm just curious if there's something you could say about that right now without interrupting the rest of the flow.
Absolutely, that's a good question. So I think this framework really only applies when a product has reached product market fit and is looking to scale revenue or scale the go-to-market team. If you look at a company like ours, like for example, HeadsUp, or a pre-product market fit company that's in search of product market fit, I'm not sure that, first of all, I'm not sure the product qualified lead criteria framework makes sense. sorry, and I'm not sure, like this interface, and also I'm not sure goaling product towards PQLs also makes sense, right? Because there's probably not enough users, to your point, so it's not statistically relevant. And B, pre-product market fit, companies aren't looking to make money, so the revenue considerations aren't top of mind yet, right? Product market fit and consistent usage is more top of mind. I think this framework comes into play when there's in product-led growth companies, oftentimes the go-to-market teams are hired a little bit later down the road, right? The head of sales or head of revenue is often brought on post-product market fit at the Series A or sometimes even Series like B stages, depending on what type of company, right? And at that point, there should be millions of users or enough users where there should be enough sample size. But once again, it depends on company as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, and also the notion of a growth team, right? Product growth teams aren't created until A, there's product market fit, and B, there's looking to scale and ramp up usage and revenue. Yeah, they're oftentimes Series B or even Series C type of teams that are formed. Yeah.
Yeah, true.
And pre-revenue, oftentimes the PM is the CEO, right? Like that's often the case as well.
And a few other things, yeah, of course.
And a few other things, yes. Okay, so back to how everything fits together. This is the equation that couples everything together. So revenue generated is equal to number of PQLs times what fraction of them does the sales team close times, well, dollar per PQL closed, right? I guess, yeah, that would be dollar per PQL closed. So this equation unites sales, product, and also marketing, because number of PQL generated, that's marketing, right? Can we get enough leads to sign up? And product, can we get those leads to go from sign up to PQL? So that's a marketing and product goal. You can break this down. Now, given a product qualified lead is generated, how can we increase the close rate? That's two things here, right? This is a sales and product joint goal. It's a sales goal because are we like selling better, right? Do we have the do we have the appropriate context? Is the talk track good? Are we selling better? That increases percent close. The other thing that increases percent close is, are the PQLs more intentional? Are they better? Are they better warmed up? And that's a product. That's a product, and that's owned by product. Yeah. So you can see that in dollars per PQL, that's both product and sales as well. Like is the product generating so much value such that you can charge more, right? And on the sales side, like are you a good seller? Can you sell larger contracts? So you can see that now there's an avenue to double click into specific metrics and have a discussion. So that's a very productive conversation to have between these different stakeholders now. Yeah, so this is interesting. Yeah, like now it's less of I think this and someone else thinks that. There's more numbers to think about, right? And so you can imagine in the future, joint teams like product and marketing can sign up for a goal to increase the number of PQLs generated, right? And sales and product can sign up for a goal to increase the close rate. And sales and product can also sign up a goal to increase the dollar amount per PQL closed. And that ultimately has the impact of lifting the area under the curve and driving revenue towards on a different trajectory, right? So you can see this PQL framework allows for marketing, sales, and product to move in lockstep with each other, to collaborate with each other, to drive revenue outcomes up. Yeah. I'll pause here. Any questions?
There's a question from Amy in the chat asking about your opinion on this. Maybe Amy, you just want to chime in. I think I was just a few slides back.
Sorry, that was kind of a long question. Hi, I work in PR and marketing now, and thank you so much for this discussion today. As you can tell, I have a very thick Southern accent. I'm from Kentucky, and so I'm very interested in your opinion on how this concept that you're talking about could be translated to the local news and newspaper industries, specifically with their apps and users, because, as you know, many print outlets are making the transition to digital, and that's even happening here in our little Appalachian region. So how could this approach be used to help these companies to maintain their app users and to grow their consumers of local news? So just coming from the journalism J school background, I'm very intrigued and would love your opinion.
Cool, Amy, nice to meet you. Really, really cool background that you
nice
have.
to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. And I have a couple of thoughts. Number one, is there opportunity to isolate? So, for example, if you see a lot of students, if you can identify a lot of students, you like reading your newspaper or paying for an individual subscription, that might make for an opportunity to sell to the whole school, right? Make a case for the school's library buying a business edition or an enterprise edition of the paper. So I can see a dynamic like that where, or for example, if there's an institution or a company that you find has many different readers, but they're disparate, right? That might make for a case to sell. And that's where a product qualified lead could make sense, because we would be able to say, hey, once again, we're breaking this down. There's fit, there's value, and there's intent, right? So if we see that there's, say, 10 different readers within an organization, maybe that's opportunity to sell a business plan to that organization. I'd say that's one opportunity to use the product qualified lead.
Yeah.
The other opportunity, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's a twofold problem too, because not only are we trying, and this is an outlet. I'm freelancing now. I'm no longer with the company, but the problem that I saw that we were having, it was twofold. You're trying to get users and consumers, but you're also, from a business to business perspective, trying to sell to advertisers. And the advertising side is really struggling, because if you don't have the users, you cannot get those advertising dollars. And so we have tried. The problem with the school issue is that the school newspaper is part of the organization as well. So they get that for free, included in their tuition, that access to the student newspaper as well as the local newspaper. But we have tried before in the past doing some geofencing, say if there's a concert in town, trying to go back and do some device ID targeted specifically for those. But I don't want to take up too much of your time talking about local news, but I do appreciate your perspective. And it's very intriguing to think, though, how this concept could be used both from a business to business perspective and from business to consumer.
Yeah. So can I ask one more question about what you said?
Sure.
So what do you want to, how do you make the case for advertisers? So you need to see like subscription growth, right? That's also, I mean, you can, I don't think that's necessarily a product qualified lead, but you could run analytics to be able to see certain usage trends, right? And you can surface these usage trends to
well, and two, from a person who consumes local news, I just know if one of my kids shows up in the local paper, I'm going to buy it, And so it depends on what your target market is, for local sports, if you're, it's just, I'm talking more about it on a local level. I understand, but I just, of course, being so passionate about the journalism industry and hoping to see that continued coverage of local events, you just always your mind and the wheels turn to see how you could translate this, because this is a great concept. Thank you.
Makes sense. Yeah, I would say the way to translate this is like identify signals in consumer usage and surface those to the advertisers maybe when they're interested, or be able to make a case.
Yes.
Yeah, it's probably that.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Very interesting question. Cool. So yeah, we have a revenue equation, and each part of this equation can be dissected cross-functionally between product, sales, and marketing. And so that makes for much more of a fruitful conversation than what we started with, right? Which is sellers don't know whether product and also marketing are carrying their weight, and conversely, product don't know that whether sales individuals are carrying their weight as well. And this results in a lot of back and forth tension and finger pointing. So wrapping this up, right? If you wanted to institutionalize a product qualified lead PQL process, what would you do? The most important thing is, as Janet mentioned, or we talked about at the beginning, making sure the appropriate stakeholders are on board, right? Like, is product on board? Is sales on board? And are they aligned in their incentives? And this actually makes it very easy for them to be, if they're on board, it makes it very easy for them to be aligned in a revenue incentive, right? No longer do they have conflicting or orthogonal goals. And we're seeing this as per the discussion with Janet, companies are increasingly rolling up to a revenue individual earlier and earlier. And product manager and growth actually increasingly also roll up into revenue. Yeah, or at least dotted line report into marketing and product, or revenue and product. We're seeing that more and more so. So once again, most important thing is there buy-in across sales and across product? Then tactically, one has to define PQLs, right? There's quite a few PQLs to define. So free to paid, paid to enterprise, cross sells, monthly to annual conversions. Each of those are a PQL and should be defined, and also need to be iterated over as product market fit and the market dynamic changes. Then sales and product should internalize the PQL into their process, right? Sales should convert PQLs into SQLs and work them as a part of a sales process. And product should goal their efforts on increasing the number of PQLs. Yeah, and this is not an easy feat, right? Defining the PQL, routing the PQLs to the appropriate seller, making sure the seller has the appropriate context within Salesforce, making sure product has the operational metric that they can A/B test on. That's often a lot of work, and we see current companies do this in two ways. Well, only one way, because the products that solve this are currently being built today, including HeadsUp. So what folks do is they piecewise together using Zapier, using internal tools, this end-to-end process, right? They for example will sync data from their data warehouse into Salesforce via reverse ETL tools like Census. Then they'll connect Salesforce to Slack via Troops, or maybe they might sync data directly from the warehouse to Slack via Zapier, right? So it's kind of a hack that we see a lot of growth leaders and also sales operations leaders do. Yeah, and that's also the opportunity that HeadsUp we see in market, right? We want to build a plug and play tool for folks to be able to define PQLs and institutionalize this process. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. We only have 10 minutes left, and I'm also happy to end early. Does anyone have questions?
Any questions from anybody else? Feel free to drop it in the comments, but we've had some really awesome questions from different folks.
Yeah, this has been a great discussion. Thanks so much, everyone, including Amy. Yeah, super interesting.
Maybe as a question, if people do have follow-up questions to you, Momo, what's the best place to reach you if they, an hour later after this, like, oh, I should have asked that question.
Let me actually send it in chat. So it's Momo, M-O-M-O, very easy to remember, like peach in Japanese, at headsup.ai.
Awesome. Any
Let
final
me
questions
actually
from-
write it down and share it so that everyone can see it. Yep.
Awesome.
Cool. So it's Momo at headsup.ai. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time. And thanks so much, Ramli, also for organizing this. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Amy said a great discussion. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon. And if you do have questions for Momo, feel free to reach out.